Hercule Poirot and the Secret Hidden in the Salt Chapter 1, Death on the Camaret Coast. The salty Atlantic air wafted like an ancient perfume over Madame Lefebvre's villa. Nestled on a cliff on the Breton coast, the property stood proudly among the pines and the tidal waves, white and topped with blue shutters. There, the sea lapped the rocks with rhythmic force like a restless heart. That morning in late August, the sky dawned overcast. The servants said the mist heralded omens, and they were right. Madame Solange Lefebvre, widow of the renowned shipping magnate Lucien Lefebvre, was found dead in her study, a low-ceilinged room with leather-bound books that smelled of old papyrus and salt. She sat in her reading chair, her head tilted, an untouched glass of cognac on the table, and an open envelope between her fingers. It was the maid, Aimée, who found her when she brought her breakfast. Madame Lefebvre wasn't responding, and the clock on the wall had stopped at 7:43. She later declared, trembling, to the local gendarmerie. There were no signs of a struggle, no visible wounds, only a look of mild surprise frozen on the deceased's face. The town doctor, Dr. Morel, was quick to diagnose a heart attack. The woman was already of a certain age, and strong emotions are unforgiving. But Captain Renaud, Brest's chief of police, a friend of the Lefebvre family for decades, was not convinced. In his experience, heart attacks didn't leave that lingering scent in the air, a barely perceptible odour, like bitter almonds, masked by cognac. Nor did they usually come with an unsigned note, written in a shaky hand, that read simply, "There is no more time to redeem oneself." The family was visiting, summoned days before by Madame herself. The reason for the meeting was supposedly the early reading of her will. At least that's what everyone said. But Renaud had seen many families in his life, and the Lefebvre didn't seem to mourn the death beyond the formalities. They were all there. Jean-Baptiste Lefebvre, eldest son, ambitious businessman, and in constant dispute with his mother. Claire Lefebvre, the youngest daughter, a bohemian artist with discreet addictions and an Italian lover that no one named. Mr. Armand Delatour, brother-in-law of the deceased and administrator of the family assets, whose smile never reached. His eyes, Helen Dubois, Solange's personal nurse, always too silent and precise. And Luc, the young gardener, almost part of the furniture, with a look too observant for a man who hardly spoke. Captain Renaud sent an urgent letter to the only man he trusted completely in such cases. Mr. Hercule Poirot, who was in Dinard, taking a holiday as meticulous as himself. Poirot's reply arrived the next day in the form of a telegram. "Intriguing matter. I will arrive tomorrow. Ask the suspects not to stray far. H.P." The villa was closed. The doors were secured. Guests were forbidden to leave. The waves continued to crash against the cliff, unfazed. But inside, hearts began to beat dissonantly. As evening fell, with a storm brewing on the horizon, Renaud looked at the envelope between Solange's fingers. It had been placed on a tray next to her will. There were no clear fingerprints, no signature, no sender. But something caught his eye about the red wax seal, a tiny, almost faded symbol, a circle with a salt cross. He didn't know why, but he thought of poison. He thought of secrets, and he thought with relief that Poirot would soon arrive. Night fell on the Breton coast, covering it with shadows and wind. And somewhere the murderer, because Renaud no longer doubted that he was one, wondered whether the Belgian with the perfect moustache would discover what had been hidden so patiently. In the Salt. Chapter 2. The Shadows of the Lefebvre. Hercule Poirot arrived at the villa at noon the following day, exactly at the promised time. His appearance at the front door was as meticulous as he was. A carefully tilted straw hat, an ebony-handled walking stick, spotless shoes despite the coastal mud, and a gleaming leather briefcase that looked as if it had never seen dust. He was greeted by Captain Renaud with a warm but hurried handshake. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Poirot. I wouldn't dare entrust this case to anyone else. My friend, for a mind like yours, this is just another crime. For me, it's a dance, and the music has already begun, right?" The first thing Poirot did was visit the office where Solange Lefebvre had been found dead. He examined the room with almost theatrical attention, without touching anything. The glass still in its place, the envelope with the cryptic note, the carpet barely moved, the back window locked from the inside. "Has anything been moved?" "Nothing," Renaud assured him, "just as we found it." "Good, because order is essential, even in death." Poirot approached the oak bookcase. "What do you notice, Hastings?" "I'm not here, Poirot," Renaud replied with a smile. "Sorry, it's customary. My friend Hastings is my usual shadow in these cases, but no matter. Look, the layer of dust on these shelves has been disturbed right here." He pointed to a gap between 2 volumes of maritime accounts. "Someone removed a book or a box, and they did it recently." Renaud frowned. "What kind of object do you think it was? A notebook, perhaps? Or a notebook? Something thin but important. Perhaps even the true reason for this death." Poirot then moved on to the informal questioning of the residents. He preferred to do so on the terrace, under the grey sky, where the sea breeze forced their faces into candour. One by one, the heirs filed past. Jean-Baptiste Lefebvre, who was the first, tall, burly, with a clenched jaw, and eyes that couldn't lie, but could evade. "Where were you at 7:30 yesterday morning? Running on the beach. I do it every day. You can ask Luc, the gardener. I run into him every time he goes to the shed." "And what relationship did you have with your mother?" "Complicated," he replied after a pause. "Admiration, frustration. I never knew if he considered me worthy of his last name." Poirot just nodded, making a mental note of the slight tremble in his finger as he spoke. Then came Claire Lefebvre, thin, nervous, with a handkerchief twisted in her hands. "I don't understand why they think it was murder. Mum was sick, even though she wouldn't admit it." "What were you doing yesterday morning, mademoiselle?" "I was in my room. I was sleeping." "Can anyone confirm this?" "No." A pause. "But no one saw me get off either." Poirot leaned towards her in a soft voice. "What did the letter your mother received say?" Claire paled. "Paper? The note he was holding as he died. Did you recognize it?" "No, I've never seen that handwriting, but—" He looked around. "Mum's been restless lately," she kept saying. "The sins of the past don't stay buried." Poirot thanked them with a slight bow. Then it was Armand Delatour, who arrived smelling of expensive tobacco, with his walnut cane and imperturbable gaze. "I always knew something like this could happen," she said with a forced sigh. "Solange was a proud woman, too proud. And what were you doing yesterday? I had breakfast on the veranda. With Hélène, the nurse. She can corroborate it." Poirot merely nodded. He noticed that Armand avoided looking at Claire, and that Jean-Baptiste never took his eyes off him. Hélène Dubois, the nurse, was the hardest to read. Her posture was rigid, her voice flat. Did Madame Lefebvre suffer from any illness that could justify a sudden death? Hypertension, yes, but it was under control. Did you notice any signs of paranoia or delirium in the days leading up to this? Yes, he would wake up in the night. He would mutter names. Once, he said, "He's coming for what we denied him." Finally, Poirot called for Luc, the gardener. A young man with a taciturn face, rough hands, and a barely audible voice. "Dit. You see anything unusual the morning of the crime?" "I saw Mr. Jean-Baptiste running, and Miss Claire smoking on the balcony." "What time?" "At 7:15, before I go get the tools." Poirot paused for a moment. Claire had said she was asleep. Was that a slip of the tongue or a lie? At the end of the afternoon, Poirot walked slowly along the beach, picking up a small shell and placing it carefully in his pocket. "My captain," he said without turning around, "this case is like a ruined recipe. All the ingredients are there, but someone has put salt where there should have been sugar." And in the distance, the cliffs echoed back. Chapter 3. The Fragmented Legacy. The next morning dawned clear, but the Lefebvre villa was still enveloped in a dense air, as if the walls themselves were waiting for Hercule Poirot to pronounce a verdict. However, the Belgian detective was in no hurry. As always, he moved forward with measured steps, allowing the pieces of the puzzle to fall into place one by one, without forcing them. After a breakfast consisting exclusively of toast, 2 perfectly symmetrical hard-boiled eggs, and a cup of thick chocolate, Poirot requested to speak to the local notary, Master Giraud, in charge of Madame Solange Lefebvre's will. "Thank you for coming at such short notice, monsieur," said Poirot, shaking his hand in the private sitting-room of the Library. Giraud, a man with a wrinkled face and round glasses, carefully placed a folder on the table. "I came prepared. Madame Lefebvre asked me to bring a copy of the will, although I must warn you, there are irregularities." "Oh, really? I love irregularities. Please continue." Maître Giraud cleared his throat. "The official will was amended 3 weeks ago. The original document divided the estate fairly evenly between his children, Jean-Baptiste and Claire, with some minor provisions for Armand Delatour and a lifetime pension for Miss Dubois. And the new version, it almost completely excludes Jean-Baptiste. It leaves most of the assets to Claire, and adds a new clause reserving a significant sum, 300,000 francs, for an anonymous person identified only as F.H. Interesting. Did Madame Lefebvre mention to you who this mysterious beneficiary was?" "No, but he did tell me that the will should be read publicly only if he died under uncertain circumstances." Poirot frowned. "Uncertain circumstances? Like poisoning?" "Exactly." Poirot allowed a charged silence to pass. Who else knew about this modification? "Just me. We signed the new will in his office, without witnesses. I immediately deposited it in my personal safe. No one else has had access to it. And yet someone might have suspected its contents. The lady was restless, Giraud said with a sigh. She was suspicious of her surroundings. She told me, "Someone in this house is watching me as if I were an obstacle." Poirot nodded gravely. Then he politely dismissed the notary and remained silent for several minutes, as if reorganizing invisible thoughts in his mind. That afternoon, Renaud approached him with a flustered air. "We have received the preliminary toxicology report. Remains of cyanide in the cognac glass. There's no doubt it was poisoned." Poirot did not seem surprised. Cyanide, swift, brutal, impersonal, very unsentimental. It's not a crime of passion, mon capitaine. It's a crime of warning. Someone didn't want to see Solange speak any more. The envelope, the note. It contained no traces of the poison. The killer placed it as a symbolic warning, a kind of coded threat. What if the letter wasn't just for her, but for someone else in this house? Shortly after, Poirot asked to speak to Claire Lefebvre again. This time in her makeshift studio, an upstairs room littered with half-finished canvases, dried brushes, and torn sketches. Claire seemed restless, as if she hadn't slept. "Do you mind if I ask you a few more questions, mademoiselle?" "No, of course not. Although I don't know if I can be of any help. Did you know the contents of the New Testament?" Claire looked up, surprised. "Is there a New Testament? Your mother changed the provisions 3 weeks ago. You become the principal heir. Jean-Baptiste is almost excluded, and there's a mysterious figure who will receive a significant sum." Claire put her hand to her chest. "Oh, my God! I had no idea." Poirot watched the reaction with interest. "And your brother? Do you suspect he might have known? Jean-Baptiste doesn't accept being rejected. Not by my mother, not by anyone, but I don't think he's capable of murder. Not like this." Poirot bent down to an abandoned canvas. It was an unfinished portrait of an elderly woman with her eyes closed. "Is this your mother?" "Yes," I started. "It a few months ago. But he never wanted to pose." And yet, Poirot ran his finger along the bottom corner of the canvas. "Here, behind the cloth, there is something written. F.H. Claire paled. "I didn't write it. Someone must have—" "Who is Ferge, mademoiselle?" "I don't know." Her voice trembled. "I don't know who it could be." Poirot stood up elegantly. "Don't worry. We'll soon find out. And when that name ceases to be a shadow, this mystery will begin to breathe clearly. That night, as the waves crashed against the rocks with the monotony of a murderous pendulum, Poirot wrote a word in his notebook, underlined twice. Inheritance. And just below, he added another, rematch. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Past. Night fell slowly over the Breton coast, dyeing the sky shades of purple and copper. The seagulls were setting, and the Lefebvre villa, illuminated only by the flickering light of oil lamps, seemed even more isolated from the world. But inside, Hercule Poirot was restless. Sitting by the window of his room, with a perfectly poured cup of chamomile tea, he gazed silently at the sea. His notebook, open on the table, contained a list of names: Jean-Baptiste, Claire, Armand, Hélène, Luc, below. A question mark, or F.H., and below Motive: inheritance, guilt, revenge. Poirot closed the notebook with a sigh. The case was like a web woven with invisible silk. All routes led to carefully buried secrets. The next day, he asked to review Madame Lefebvre's personal files. Claire, somewhat reluctant at first, led him to the attic, where several stacked boxes awaited their fate of oblivion. Poirot, wearing white gloves he'd brought just in case, began to go through the documents one by one. Most were old letters, property records and medical bills, but in a smaller box labelled in pencil, "Personal Confidential," he found something more intriguing. A photograph album. The first pages showed images of youth. A young Lucien Lefebvre in a ball gown, Solange in a long dress in a flower garden, Jean-Baptiste and Claire as children. But a few pages later, Poirot stopped. A black and white photograph. 3 figures, Solange in the centre with a serious face. To her left, Claire, about 18 years old, and to the right, a young man. Who wasn't Jean-Baptiste? "Mademoiselle Claire," Poirot asked gently. "Who is this young man?" Claire approached cautiously. Seeing the image, she stiffened. "That's it. I didn't know that photo still existed. This is Frederick Hercule." Poirot mentally noted the initials F.H. A relative? Not exactly. He was my father's illegitimate son. No one said it openly, of course, but it was obvious. Solange took him into her home for a few years, out of charity, she said. But deep down, she despised him. She saw him as a silent shame. And what happened to him? Claire lowered her voice. He left. One day, he just disappeared. He was 19. I think my mother forced him to leave. He never wrote to us again. We didn't even know if he was still alive. Poirot remained silent for a few seconds, staring at the photograph. Do you think Frederick might have reasons to hate his mother? If he's alive, yes, all of them. She took everything from him, his last name, his dignity, his place in the world. Poirot thanked him with a subtle bow and descended with the album in his arms. The discovery had added a new dimension to the case. Frederick Hercule, the forgotten son, the beneficiary of the will, the author of the note, the murderer, but he couldn't say for sure yet. Cyanide wasn't a matter of passion or impulse. It was the work of someone meticulous, cold, perhaps planned for years. Later, Poirot asked to see the contents of the small shed next to the garden. Luc, the gardener, showed him there without a word. Inside were rusty tools, sacks of compost, and an old filing cabinet with mouldy labels. Poirot observed the structure of the ground, crouching down slowly. Has this shed always been closed? Yes. Only I have the key, Luc said. And has anyone tried to force it? Not that I know of. Poirot ran his fingers over a loose board, and as he pressed it, a small cavity opened. Inside, hidden in a cloth bag, was a metal box. Luc paled. I didn't know. That wasn't there before. Poirot opened the box. It contained aged papers. A smudged letter, dated 1932, signed by Lucien Lefebvre, addressed to Frederick H. In it, the father apologized for not having been able to defend you from his wrath. Poirot closed the box delicately. Who placed this here and when? I don't know yet. But my friend Luc, This box is the shadow of a crime that didn't begin yesterday." As he walked away, Luke looked at him with a mixture of respect and fear. Poirot had read him. This quiet young man knew more than he was letting on. That evening, Poirot wrote a new entry in his notebook. "Forgotten blood does not dissolve in the sea." And next to it, with a darker stroke, "Has Frederick Hercule returned?" Chapter 5. The Name No One Mentioned. At dawn, a pearly grey sky covered the Breton coast. Offshore winds howled louder than in previous days, as if the sea itself were warning that something dormant was beginning to awaken. In the village, however, an artificial silence reigned, tense, expectant. Hercule Poirot quickly set up his makeshift operations centre in the music room, a room filled with out-of-tune instruments, heavy curtains, and an unlit fireplace. There, along with his leather suitcase, he organised a series of documents, photos, letters, and notes, ready to take the next step in the investigation. The discovery of the name Frederick Hercule, the letter written by Lucien Lefebvre, had completely changed the axis of the mystery. Poirot knew that it was no longer just an inheritance, but a debt from the past, carefully ignored by everyone, until now. Captain Renaud arrived shortly after, with an envelope in his hand. "I got an interesting piece of information. I went to the Civil Registry Office in Brest this morning. There's a record of a Frederick Hercule, born in 1912, with no legally recognized father. His mother died in 1930, and then—" Silence. No employment, no marriage, no registered death. As if he'd decided to disappear from the world, or as if someone had helped him do it, Poirot murmured. "Or forced?" Poirot nodded gravely. "And what about the surname Hercule? It's not that common around here. Did you find any others?" "3. One died in the war. Another lives in Lyon. The third— Well, here's the funny thing." Renaud opened his notebook. "A certain Francis Hercule, current resident of Saint-Malo, owner of an artisanal sea salt shop. He's around 40 years old. He wouldn't be Frederick, but he could be his son." Poirot's eyes narrowed. Handmade sea salt. The echo of the title of his case resonated in his mind. The secret hidden in salt. "My captain, we must visit that store. Today, the trip to Saint-Malo took just over an hour. Francis Hercule's shop was tucked away on a side street, between bakeries and perfumed soap shops. Its sober, neat facade displayed a carved wooden sign, Hercule, salt from the coast. Inside, the place was surprisingly elegant. Shelves were arranged with jars of salt in different textures, cursive labels, and glass cabinets of scented mixtures. A bell rang as Poirot and Renaud crossed the threshold. The man who greeted them was about 45 years old, with a trimmed beard and clear eyes. He wore a white coat and fine linen gloves. "Good morning, gentlemen. May I help you?" Poirot didn't reply immediately. He was carefully examining every corner of the room. Then he turned to the man. "You are Francis Hercule, aren't you?" The man nodded, somewhat cautiously. "Do we know each other?" "No, sir, but I know your last name. And someone you could have called father, Frederick Hercule." For a moment, Francis remained silent. Then, in a low voice, "I don't usually talk about that, but yes, Frederick was my father. He died 8 years ago. He never reconciled himself with his past, nor with his adoptive mother, Solange Lefebvre. Francis pressed his lips together. She banished him. She made him feel like he was a mistake. She never wanted to see him again, but he remembered her every day. Sometimes he wrote letters. He never sent them. Poirot watched him closely. "Have you received any letters from Madame Lefebvre in the last few days?" Francis hesitated. "Yes, 2 weeks ago, unexpectedly." He asked me to travel to the village, that there was something he needed to deliver to me personally. But I didn't go. I thought it was a cruel game. I only responded with a brief note. Poirot inclined his head. What did he say? Just one line. "There's no more time for redemption." The same message found on Solange's hand. Renaud and Poirot exchanged a glance. "Monsieur Héroux," said Poirot with strained courtesy, "can you prove that you were not in Camaret-sur-Mer on the day of Madame Lefebvre's death?" Francis nodded. "Of course. I spent the whole day at a regional market in Quimper. Several merchants can attest to that. I sold more than 30 batches of salt. I have receipts. So maybe it wasn't you, but someone else could have read that letter." Francis crossed his arms. "Do you think someone followed me? Or someone who found their answer and decided to act before you?" As they returned to the villa, Poirot remained silent. The circle was beginning to close. The letter that was supposed to have reconciled mother and son was intercepted, and the note struck back in the form of a threat. But who, with access to such correspondence, knew enough to kill with poison? A phrase floated in his mind like an echo. Sometimes crime is not committed out of hatred for the dead, but out of fear of the living. And now, thought Poirot, there was someone in the villa who deeply feared that the surname Héroux claim again what was once denied to him. Chapter 6. The look behind the door. The return to the villa was silent. Hercule Poirot, wrapped in his light grey coat, watched the curves of the road with his eyes fixed, but his mind was far from the car window. Each piece of the case, the missing letter, the amended will, the name erased from the family records, turned like gears in an antique clock, and Poirot listened intently to the ticking of hidden motives. Upon their arrival, the air was heavier than usual. A thunderstorm was brewing on the horizon. At the entrance, Luc, the gardener, was sweeping leaves as if his life depended on it. Seeing the detective, he lowered his eyes and continued sweeping. Poirot didn't greet him. He simply watched him go by. An hour later, Poirot requested a private meeting with Jean-Baptiste Lefebvre. The eldest son appeared, his brow furrowed, his suit wrinkled, as if he had slept in his clothes. He had lost some of his usual composure. Another round of questions. "Monsieur Poirot?" he said as he entered the library. "Just a few, but this time I'd rather it be straightforward." Jean-Baptiste shrugged. Poirot got up from the armchair and began to walk around the room, like someone measuring a field before sowing. "You knew about the new will, monsieur. Your reaction from the beginning wasn't one of surprise, but of suppressed rage. Your mother had almost completely disinherited you. Your gestures, your tension, and above all, your silences showed it." Jean-Baptiste looked at him without blinking. "And that makes me a murderer? No. but it makes him a man with a motive. And motive, Monsieur Lefebvre, is the spark that lights the fire, or the spark that smothers it, depending on your conscience. Jean-Baptiste stood up abruptly. I had no idea about the will until yesterday. Claire did. She was always the favourite, the spoiled one, the protected one. And you know why? Because she wasn't a threat. Because, despite her talent, her sensitivity, she never aspired to what I did. Control of all this. The villa, the fortune, the name. Poirot watched him quietly. Et Frédéric? Jean-Baptiste froze. Who? Frédéric Héroux. Have you ever heard of him? Just once, when I was a child. I remember my mother crying, my father screaming. A name that shouldn't be repeated. I thought it was a myth. It wasn't. And now that myth has returned, in the form of an inheritance, a letter, and perhaps revenge. Jean-Baptiste sank into the armchair. My mother had invisible enemies, Poirot, but they were all in her head, not in the house. Later, Poirot discreetly made his way to the rooms in the east wing, where the servants slept. He knocked on Hélène Dubois' door. The nurse opened it, still wearing her apron and with a neutral expression. "May I come in, mademoiselle?" "Of course." The interior was austere. A bed with ironed sheets, a table with a pocket watch, a closed wardrobe, and a small cross on the wall. Poirot inspected the place with a gentle, almost affectionate gaze. Nothing has changed since his death, has it? No, I haven't changed anything in my routine. My work continues, even if there's no patient. Poirot sat down delicately. Mademoiselle, you had Madame Lefebvre's absolute confidence. You were at her side at night. You listened to her fears. Did she ever speak to you about Frédéric? For the first time, Hélène's mask showed a crack, a slight tremor in her lips. Yes, once. It was a few months ago. He asked me if I believed the past could return in tangible form. Then he said, "There's something buried in this house that still breathes." Poirot remained silent. Then he looked towards the closed cupboard. "Can? It's just clothes," she said, but nodded. Poirot opened the wardrobe. Inside, everything seemed in order. Until at the back, among folded blankets, he saw an envelope. He gently pulled it out. "What is this?" Hélène spoke. "I hadn't seen it before." Poirot opened it. Inside, a note written in the same handwriting as the letter found with Solange. There are those who believe that erasing a name makes it a mistake. But mistakes don't dissolve with salt. They harden. Poirot read it several times. Then he put the paper away. "Thank you, mademoiselle. This message wasn't meant for you. It was left here for someone to find, perhaps by mistake or by strategy." Before leaving, Poirot turned around and asked, "Where exactly were you on the morning of the death?" "In the kitchen, preparing Madame's medication. Luc saw me. He can confirm it." Poirot nodded slowly. "Ah, Luc, always watching from where no one is looking." That evening, Poirot didn't go down to dinner. Instead, he asked for a cup of tea to be brought to his room. No one saw him for the rest of the day. Only Luc, who passed by in the corridor in the evening, said he had noticed that the Belgian's door was ajar. And inside, the figure of Poirot, furiously writing in his notebook, surrounded by photographs, letters, and an open jar of sea salt in front of a lit candle. Chapter 7. The Salt Cells. When the sun reappeared between the folds of clouds, the Villa Lefebvre seemed frozen in its own silence. It was as if the walls were listening, as if every corner held its breath, waiting for the outcome. Poirot descended the stairs shortly before breakfast, impeccably dressed, his moustache more symmetrical than ever. In the dining room, only Claire and Luc were seated. Jean-Baptiste had gone for a walk, according to Aimé, and Hélène was still in the kitchen. "Good morning, Mademoiselle Claire. Monsieur Luc," he greeted politely. Claire forced a smile and pushed her cup away. "I don't know how you can have breakfast so peacefully, Monsieur Poirot, with all this on top of you. Internal order helps us confront external chaos," he replied, sitting down. "And speaking of chaos, last night I found something very revealing in Mademoiselle Dubois' room." Claire looked up. Something from Helen. A note, signed in the same handwriting as the message found in her mother's hand. I'm not accusing her, of course, but someone has been planting these notes like seeds in fertile soil, hoping they'll germinate fear. Luc, who had remained silent, murmured, "Maybe they don't want the truth to be revealed. Maybe they want it to be destroyed from within." Poirot watched him for a long moment. "Monsieur Luc, you have lived here for many years, haven't you? 10, almost 11. And you know the passageways of this villa better than anyone. The corners no one ever sets foot in. The hidden accesses to the attic, to the shed, even to the pantry in the old wing, right?" Luc nodded slowly. "Yes. Some of them don't even exist on the maps anymore. And have you noticed anything strange lately? Lights where there shouldn't be any. Noises when no one's around." Claire turned to him. "Have you seen anything, Luc?" Hesitated. "I saw a figure enter the pantry the day before Madame Solange died. It was almost 7 o'clock. I thought it was Jean-Baptiste, but the figure was thinner. Could it have been Frédéric Héroux? I don't know. I didn't see the face." Poirot leaned towards him. "And what were you doing in that wing so early?" "I was checking some old tools. It was damp. I was thinking of moving some boxes." Poirot nodded slowly. After breakfast, he asked to be escorted to the east wing, the original wing of the villa, dating back even before Lucien Lefebvre's death. Passing through a corridor lined with family portraits, Poirot stopped in front of a smaller painting, partially covered by a curtain. He discovered it. It was an old portrait of Lucien, with a child at his side. It wasn't Jean-Baptiste, nor was it Claire. It was another. Child, dark-skinned, serious, with intense eyes. "Frédéric," murmured Poirot. Claire came closer. "I didn't know that painting still existed. It's funny how forgotten images survive longer than the memories that accompany them," said Poirot. "Look at the frame, it's dirty, but there's a gap behind it, as if someone had hidden something." With gloved hands, Poirot extracted a yellowed, brittle sheet of paper. It was part of a diary, signed by Solange. "I've seen his name again in my dreams. F.H. I repeat it silently while pretending to sleep. Lucien left him for me without asking. Or I didn't know how to love him. But I fear that one day he will claim what he believes is his." Claire took a deep breath. Mother lived tormented, and someone took advantage of that torment to prepare his downfall, Poirot replied. Further on, they inspected the pantry in the old wing. It was a large room with disordered shelves and a penetrating smell of dust and damp wood. Poirot examined each wall until he found a trapdoor in the floor, barely perceptible under a broken box. With Luc's help, they lifted it. A stone tunnel ran beneath the house, dark, damp, and with no trace of recent use, until Poirot saw the mud marks along the edge. Someone came down here, not long ago, very recently. He went down with an oil lamp. The tunnel led to a small, quiet, underground chamber. There he found a makeshift table. On top, empty jars, a burnt piece of paper, and a jar of sea salt, the same kind Francis Hercule sold. Poirot bent down, touched the surface, and then looked into the darkness. Something was planned here. I don't know yet if it was the crime or a cover-up. He climbed slowly, closed the trapdoor, and turned to Luc. "Tell me, sir, who else knew about this tunnel?" Luc swallowed. "Just me." And Madame Lefebvre, Poirot looked at him intensely, but said nothing. That night, Poirot wrote a single sentence in his notebook. Crime doesn't live on the surface, but in the densest layers, like a secret, in salt. And next to it, underlined 3 times, the murderer isn't afraid of being seen. He's afraid of being remembered. Chapter 8. The Voice of the Lost Notebook. The night brought with it a moderate thunderstorm, enough to rattle the villa's windows, but not so intense as to erase the tense calm that enveloped each of its occupants. In the west wing, where the heirs' chambers were located, the tension could have been cut with a knife. Footsteps became more cautious, the doors more silent when they closed. Poirot, however, was wide awake. He paced in slow circles inside his room, musing softly. The discovery of the passageway, the hidden portrait, and the jar of salt in the underground chamber had confirmed what he had already suspected. Solange Lefebvre's murder was neither a last-minute impulse nor a disguised accident. It was the culminating act of a story that had been brewing for decades. The next morning, as the first rays of light caressed the damp garden, Poirot asked everyone in the household, without exception, to gather in the main room. Jean-Baptiste was the last to arrive, his face tense and dark circles under his eyes. Claire was wearing a thick shawl, her hands clasped together as if protecting herself from something invisible. Hélène stood erect, expressionless. Luc remained, at the back, almost against the wall, completely silent. "My friends," Poirot began, "this meeting isn't about accusing anyone. Not yet. It's about exposing what's already evident. The crime committed against Madame Lefebvre wasn't just about ambition. It was also a form of revenge. A revenge built on a name they tried to bury, Frédéric Hercule." A murmur ran through the room. "The name Hercule," he continued, "appears in letters, in the will, on the walls of this villa, even in a hidden portrait, but also in the consciousness of those who lived here." Claire leaned forward slightly. "Do you think Frédéric came back?" "No," Poirot said firmly. "Frédéric is dead. He has been dead for 8 years, according to his son Francis Hercule. But the memory of Frédéric was enough to sow fear. Someone in this house feared that if Francis ever inherited the inheritance or claimed the Lefebvre name, the whole truth would come out, and that could not be allowed. Jean-Baptiste crossed his arms. "Are you saying that one of us killed Mother to protect ourselves from a ghost? Not a ghost, a scandal, a humiliation, or a truth that could ruin reputations, or steal a fortune?" Poirot turned to Claire. "You said you knew nothing about Frederick, and yet his signature appears on the back of the hidden portrait." "Along with the initials F.H. I didn't write it," Claire insisted. "That portrait was in the attic since I was a child. Anyone could have done it." Poirot nodded. "Perhaps. But it was you who found in one of your paint boxes a black-covered notebook. You looked at it briefly, and then hid it again." Claire paled. "How do you know that?" "Because Aimée saw it. She confessed to me this morning. The notebook was her mother's, a diary. She found it by chance, and she didn't want to share it." Claire hesitated. Then, resignedly, she stood up and disappeared for a few seconds. She returned with the notebook in her hand. "I was afraid it would drive everyone crazy, that it would make things worse." Poirot delicately took the notebook. He opened it. The first pages were everyday reflections, routine notes. But after a certain point, the tone changed. "I've seen him again. The same face, on a different body. I don't know if it's Frederick or someone imitating him. He follows me from the beach to my room. He doesn't speak, but he looks at me with the same eyes I never knew how to love. I'm old, but I still know when death approaches in disguise." Poirot slowly closed the notebook. Madame Lefebvre lived with guilt, and also with the certainty that her past had returned to settle scores. The problem is that that past didn't move on its own. Someone here used it as a mask. Luc took a step forward. "I have something to show you." Everyone turned. Luc took a small cloth bundle out of his pocket. He untied it and pulled out a rusty locket, inside which was a photograph. Solange, Frederick, and a small boy, Francis. "I found it in the workshop, hidden in a beam. I was going to put it away, but now I know I should show it." Poirot took it and examined it. Then, without looking up, "Thank you, Luc. You've seen what others didn't want to see." Before leaving, Poirot uttered one last sentence. "Salt preserves, but it also reveals. Trapped in its crystals are the traces of what we try to forget. And this crime can't be hidden much longer." And with that, the room fell silent, except for a distant rumble of thunder fading into the sea. Chapter 9. A truth that burns silently. The next day dawned motionless. The night storm had left dark puddles in the garden and broken branches along the gravel path. The Lefebvre villa no longer seemed like a home, but an elegant mausoleum that held more secrets than it could bear. Hercule Poirot didn't appear at breakfast, nor did he answer Aimé's knock. When he finally came down, it was close to noon, his face serene, but his eyes as sharp as razors. "Today," he announced bluntly to Captain Renaud, "I need you to gather everyone in the lounge at 5 o'clock sharp. No one is to leave. No one is to be absent." Renaud, now accustomed to Poirot's uncompromising tone, nodded without question. Poirot spent most of the day reviewing documents in the library. He asked for personnel records, old inventories of the villa, and notarial deeds from the past too. decades. He arranged everything in small piles on the table. Every so often he muttered softly, as if talking to himself or to some ghost only he could see. At 3 in the afternoon, Claire entered the library unannounced. She was holding a crumpled letter. It was inside one of my sketchbooks. I hadn't seen it before. It's Mum's. Poirot took it carefully. Solange's handwriting, unmistakable, ran over the lines with a restrained trembling. If anything happens to me, don't blame those who stayed behind. The mistake was mine, long ago, when I chose what was expedient over what was right. And now I fear that the forgotten son isn't as far away as everyone thinks. It's a testimony, Poirot murmured. Not a confession, but a trace. Thank you, mademoiselle. This confirms what I already suspected. Claire looked at him uneasily. Do you think Francis came here secretly? Poirot shook his head slowly. No, he didn't need to come. He just needed to be remembered, and someone used his memory for a specific purpose, to manipulate fear. And who? You'll find out this afternoon. But I advise you one thing, mademoiselle. Remember every word spoken in this house over the past few days. The truth is often hidden in the phrases we overlook. At 5 o'clock sharp, the room was set up like a theatre stage. The afternoon light filtered through the windows in straight beams. The suspects took their places like actors, waiting for the final act. Jean-Baptiste, tense, arms crossed. Claire, hands clasped in her lap. Armand Delatour, serious, almost cynical, as if he expected little from all this. Hélène, sitting perfectly straight, expressionless. Luc, standing in the background, silent, and Aimée, trembling, slightly, by the door. Poirot stood before them all. His voice, when he spoke, was soft, but forceful. My friends, I've watched, I've listened, I've pieced together every loose thread of this story. And now I believe I can offer you a reconstruction of the crime. Everyone held their breath. Madame Lefebvre was murdered with cyanide. We know that. The cognac. Glass was the vehicle. But the poison wasn't clumsily prepared. It was precisely dosed. The note she was holding was written by someone who knew the ghosts of the past. It wasn't a warning. It was a message. Poirot turned slowly towards Hélène. Mademoiselle Dubois, you lived with Solange. You heard her speak of Frederick. He was her constant shadow. And yet you were never surprised to hear his name. You never denied knowing him. Nor were you surprised when we discovered the passageway. Why? Hélène kept her composure. I was there to look after his health. Nothing more. Ah, but that's not entirely true. You didn't just look after her. You watched over her. Because you knew that guilt could make her talk. And if she did, her world, her position in this house, her very history could be shaken. Are you implying, Hélène began, but Poirot raised a hand. You didn't kill Madame Lefebvre out of greed. You did it because you couldn't bear to sustain the balance of a lie you'd been living for years. You are the mother of Francis Héroux. Absolute silence fell over the room. Claire covered her mouth. Jean-Baptiste sat up abruptly. That's impossible. On the contrary, Poirot said, you worked for the Lefebvre family long before you became a nurse, as a governess, then as a maid. And when Solange took the child from you, you kept silent. But you never forgot. You raised Francis in secret far away, under his biological father's surname. And when your son grew up and wrote too, Solange, you intercepted the letter. Hélène closed her eyes. It wasn't his right. It wasn't his right to send it to you. Not after what he did. I didn't kill him out of revenge. It was out of justice. But that's not justice, mademoiselle. It's despair. Justice, like salt, can heal, but it can also destroy if used in excess. Poirot stepped back, letting the words settle like ashes on the room. And for the first time since she arrived, Hélène burst into tears, silently, without fuss. Like someone who has finally let go of an impossible burden, and in that villa where salt preserved more than fish, Poirot had brought back the bitter taste of truth. Chapter 10. Where the guilt doesn't go away. The silence that followed Hélène Dubois' confession was not broken by shouts or protests. It was an absolute silence, heavy with the weight of the newborn truth. Even the old pendulum clock in the room seemed to stop for a moment, as if time itself needed a pause to comprehend what had just happened. Poirot, standing in the centre of the room, carefully observed each face. Their reactions spoke volumes. Claire was trembling discreetly, her eyes glassy. Jean-Baptiste seemed rooted in a mixture of rage and bewilderment. Luc kept his gaze on the floor, and Armand simply smiled with an ironic curve to his lips, as if he had anticipated the fall of a curtain. "Thank you for your sincerity, Mademoiselle Dubois," Poirot said, breaking the stillness. "But there is something else we must clarify. You have confessed to the murder, and yet the whole truth is still hidden beneath a final layer." Hélène looked up, reddened by tears. "What do you mean?" "To the moral authorship of the crime. Because while you were the one who poured the poison, you weren't the one who planned it." The murmur was instantaneous. Hélène shook her head, barely, but Poirot didn't need her confirmation. The crime was carried out by his hand, yes, but it was induced, carefully planted, by someone else. Someone who knew about Francis, who knew Solange's guilt, who understood the effect that name would have on her, and who used that information to trigger the final collapse. "Are you implying I was manipulated?" Hélène whispered. "Exactly that, mademoiselle. You believed you were acting out of justice, out of maternal protection. But the elements that led to your decision were carefully orchestrated by someone else, someone who knew exactly what to reveal and what to hide." Poirot turned to Armand. "Delatour, do you wish to confess now, monsieur?" Everyone looked at him. Armand didn't flinch. "Confess what, Monsieur Poirot? That you're the one who instigated all of this. You, the silent brother-in-law, the loyal steward, that you knew of Frederick's existence for years, and that you hid the original letter Lucien Lefebvre wrote, that you placed the jar of salt in the underground chamber, that you copied Hélène's handwriting to falsify the notes and sow panic in Solange's fragile mind, that you knew about the tunnel and about the old photo hidden behind the portrait, and most importantly, that you had access to everything, to the house, to the documents, to the secrets." Armand remained unperturbed. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Poirot took a step forward. "No? Then perhaps you can explain why traces of cyanide were found on the cap of the cane you always carry. The same cane that was inadvertently left next to the cognac glass before Solange took it. For the first time, Armand blinked rapidly. A coincidence? No, sir. A signature. Captain Renaud, who had been standing on the sidelines, stepped forward. "Do you want me to arrest him?" Poirot raised a hand. "Not yet. I want you to hear this first." He took a folded document out of his pocket. A copy of Lucien, Lefebvre's original will. The actual document, not the one registered after his death. This one was never filed, but was found in a forgotten correspondence box in Maître Giraud's office. "And what does he say?" Claire asked, on the verge of tears. Poirot unfolded the paper. It says that Frédéric Héroux, acknowledged as Lucien's biological son, was entitled to a significant share of the inheritance. That clause was removed in later versions. And who helped manipulate them? Armand Delatour, the same one who feared that Francis Héroux's return would not only ruin the Lefebvre name, but also jeopardize his own position within the estate. Jean-Baptiste jumped up. So all this wasn't about mother. It was about money. And out of pride, said Poirot. Crime always needs a noble pretext, but its root almost always is terribly vulgar. Renaud approached Armand, who offered no resistance. "My congratulations, Monsieur Poirot," he said as he was handcuffed. "The only thing I underestimated was your damned grey matter." Poirot inclined his head gently, and his inability to leave a glass of cognac untouched. Hours later, when the police had taken Armand Delatour away, and Hélène was escorted away as an accomplice, Poirot remained alone in the library. Claire entered silently. "Are you satisfied?" "No, mademoiselle. Satisfied isn't the word. Just at peace, like the sea after a storm." Claire sat down opposite him. "Do you think Francis will know the truth?" Poirot nodded. "I've already written to him. He deserves to know everything, especially that his mother didn't forget him, and that his name was the key to everything." Claire looked down. "And what will happen to us? That, mademoiselle, depends on what you decide to do with the truth. Sometimes you can't redeem the past, but you can build something that honors it." And in the background, between the shelves, the portrait of Solange Lefebvre seemed, for the first time, to have recovered the silence it had so feared losing. Chapter 11. The Echo Under the Stairs. 3 days after Armand Delatour's arrest, the Villa Lefebvre was a different place. The tension that had coiled around every corner seemed to have unravelled, but what remained in its place wasn't relief. It was something more complex, a mixture of emptiness, reflection, and a slight but persistent sense of moral defeat. Claire had retired to her study and was barely eating. Jean-Baptiste had left the house that same morning, lightly packed and without saying goodbye to anyone. Hélène Dubois, awaiting trial, was being held in Brest, where the authorities had already begun to reconstruct the chain of events. Poirot, however, had not yet left. Renaud found him in the garden, next to a wrought-iron bench overlooking the sea. "Don't you ever get tired, Poirot?" the captain asked with a weary smile. "Ah, mon ami," Poirot replied without taking his eyes off the horizon. "Tiredness is a luxury enjoyed by those who believe the world is orderly. I know that order must be created with great patience. And I suppose you finished making it here, right?" Poirot didn't reply immediately. Instead, he took a small piece of yellowish paper, torn at the edges, out of his coat. "I found this morning, under the second staircase in the old wing, between a crack in the baseboard, as if someone had wanted to hide it, but also leave it as a witness." Renaud took the paper carefully. "What is it?" "Half a letter. From Frédéric Héroux to Solange." Poirot began to recite it, as if he had memorized it word for word. "I don't expect your forgiveness. I just want you to know that I don't harbour hatred. But if anything happens to me, if the blood that runs through my veins must end in silence, at least let it be a record that my name existed, even if you, Mother, have done everything possible to erase it." The captain was silent for a few seconds. "So, you were really planning to come back? Or at least be acknowledged," said Poirot. "That letter never arrived. Or it arrived and someone made sure it wasn't read. At this point, it doesn't matter. What matters is that Frederick didn't die a ghost. He died with a name, and his son Francis can still decide what to do with him." That afternoon, Poirot requested one last meeting with Claire. She received him in the glass-enclosed gallery, where the geraniums were beginning to wilt after the rain of the previous few days. Her hair was carelessly tied back, and she wore a dark dress that accentuated her pallor. "Are you coming to tell me to leave too?" "No, mademoiselle. I came to tell you that you must decide if you want to stay." "And why would I? This house is nothing more than a mausoleum with doors. Everything it represents is rotten." Poirot sat down opposite her. "Sometimes, mademoiselle, houses don't inherit sins. They just hide them. The problem isn't in the walls, but in what we allow to live within them." Claire looked out the window. "This all started before I was born, and yet it feels like it was my fault. Like I was part of a play no one asked me to be in." "You are the only one who can write the last act," Poirot said gently. "Francis Héroux still exists. His mother is paying for what she did. His uncle will face justice. And you, mademoiselle, can choose what to do with what remains." Claire didn't respond immediately. She just stood up and walked over to one of the shelves. From there, she took a rectangular box, which she placed in front of Poirot. "This belonged to Frédéric. I found it years ago and kept it without understanding. It's a notebook of sketches. Almost all of them are of the sea." Poirot opened it gently. Charcoal drawings, simple but soulful strokes. Waves, lighthouses, boats, blurred faces. On the last page, written in French in imperfect handwriting, "The sea holds no grudges. It only returns what is thrown at it." Poirot closed the notebook. Man who thinks like that didn't deserve to die forgotten. "Do you think Francis will want to talk to me?" Claire asked quietly. "I don't know, but you have to try. Not for redemption, but for humanity." The next day, Poirot packed his suitcase. At the Brest train station, waiting for the express to Paris, he watched the seagulls float lazily over the docks. The Solange Lefebvre case was over. But deep inside, something remained unresolved, not for lack of resolution, but by the very nature of justice. Sometimes, she thought, justice doesn't feel like a victory. Sometimes it's just a line drawn between guilt and understanding. And as the train began to move, Poirot, with his perfectly trimmed moustache and his hat poised impeccably, thought of one last sentence. Salt preserves life, yes, but it can also preserve wounds. And so, without applause or fanfare, Hercule Poirot left behind a villa where the ghosts had finally been named. Chapter 12. The Last Salt of the Sea. Weeks passed since Hercule Poirot's departure from the Villa Lefebvre. Autumn slowly settled on the Breton coast, covering the rooftops with a patina of damp and dried leaves. The villa, with its large windows and white facade, no longer held the same sepulchral silence of the previous days, but neither had it recovered the bustle of times past. It was a place that had learned to breathe differently. Claire Lefebvre didn't abandon the house. On the contrary, for the first time in her memory, she decided to stay. Not out of attachment to the family name or family duty, but out of a personal decision. She began transforming the interior, painting by painting, carpet by carpet. She removed portraits, opened windows, and let in the fresh air. And in a decision that surprised even the family notary, he contacted Francis Héroux. The letter he sent her was short, written in his own hand. I don't know if anything can repair the past, but what I can do is not repeat it. This house, which once rejected him, is now open. And even if he doesn't accept her, I want her to know that her name is no longer feared. Claire Lefebvre. She didn't get an immediate response. For days, Claire stared at the mailbox as if waiting for a verdict. But time, like the sea, moves forward without guarantees. One cold November morning, the regional train arriving from Saint-Malo stopped at the Camaret-sur-Mer station. Among the few passengers who got off, one stood out with his slow gait, his grey coat and the wooden box he was carrying. It was Francis. He didn't ask for taxis. He walked. Upon arriving at the villa, he didn't ring the doorbell. He stood in front of the gate, gazing at the facade as if he were looking at a painting he'd seen before, albeit in different colours. Claire walked out the front door unhurriedly. Their eyes met for several long seconds. I thought you'd never come, she said. I didn't know that either, Francis replied, but this time I wanted to see for myself if doors that close always stay closed forever. Claire stepped away. Come in. There's no one here to hide your last name any more. He didn't cross the threshold immediately. I didn't come for the inheritance, or the name. I just wanted to know if the silence had been broken. Claire stared at him. The silence killed us all. We don't want it any more. Inside the villa, Francis didn't ask anything. He walked slowly through the rooms. He looked at the empty frames, where the portraits had been, the fireplace without embers, the piano covered with a sheet, and finally he reached the study where his grandmother, Solange, had died. Claire didn't accompany him. When he came out, his eyes were wet. This was where... Claire nodded. Yeah, Francis nodded slowly. Then he opened the box he had brought with him. It contained small jars of salt. They were part of his personal collection, a blend from his artisanal line, not like the tourist-produced jars. These had handwritten labels. One read simply, Return. I'd like to leave some here, he said without asking permission. As a witness, Claire didn't stop him. She accompanied him to the backyard, where he dug a small hole at the foot of the cliff and buried 2 sealed jars. Then he gently covered the soil, as if planting a seed. "Not so they'll be forgotten," he murmured, "but so they'll flourish in another way." Afterward, they shared tea on the veranda. They spoke little, and without either of them saying so, they both understood that the most important conversation had already taken place. A few days later, Poirot received a letter at his London apartment. It was from Claire. It read, "Dear Monsieur Poirot, thanks for everything. Francis was here. I don't know if he'll come back. I don't know if he wants to be part of this story, or just close it out. But now he knows he has a place. For my part, I am learning to live without fear of the echo of secrets. The town is still standing, but it no longer weighs the same. With gratitude, Claire." Poirot read the letter, folded it delicately, and placed it in a drawer where he kept certain mementos, not of the crime, but of the humanity behind them. Then he poured his cup of hot chocolate, took a sip, and muttered to himself, "Justice has been done. But what truly redeems is the truth when it stops hurting." And somewhere on the Breton coast, amidst the salt, the wind, and the silence, the name Hercule was no longer a ghost. It was an accepted echo, a legacy that at last dared to be spoken. Chapter 13. The Traces That Are Not Erased. With winter approaching, Villa-le-Fèvre breathed a new calm. The sea continued to crash against the cliff's rocks, but the sound no longer evoked threat, but rather a constant hypnotic music. Inside the house, Claire walked with more confident steps. The air, once heavy with unspoken stories, now flowed, with an honesty that sometimes hurt, but at least it was hers. Little by little, some closed spaces were opened up. The gallery once again received natural light all day long. Solange's office, once a sanctuary of silence, was converted into a small library for the residents. Even Aimée, the maid who had left shortly after the events, returned of her own free will, ready to take care of the villa under new conditions. No secrets. But one December afternoon, while Claire was sorting through some old trunks for donation, she found an envelope she hadn't seen before. It was sealed with a red string and had no address or recipient, just an initial on the front. He thought of Luc. The young gardener had disappeared the same day Francis left. He had left his uniform folded on the bed, and a simple message for Poirot. "Thank you for seeing what others don't." No one had heard from him again, and although there was no reason to suspect him of being the perpetrator of the crime, his passing had hung in the air like an incomplete whisper. Claire opened the envelope. Inside, she found a letter and a small field notebook covered with dry earth. The letter read, "Madame Claire, I was never part of the Lefebvre family, nor did I pretend to be. But for more than 10 years, I saw and heard more than I was allowed to. I saw Solange cry alone, long before she got sick. I saw Armand filing papers at night. I heard Jean-Baptiste arguing with his mother, and you singing softly while secretly painting portraits you never showed. I saw how this house fell apart, not because of lack of maintenance, but because of too much memory tunnel sand. By Frederick, by Helen." I knew it wasn't my place to speak, but when Poirot came, I understood that sometimes silence is also complicit. Now I'm leaving. to find a place where the past isn't a structure. Thank you for not looking down on me. The notebook contained botanical notes, drawings of the garden, dates, and changes in the plants. But in the middle of those pages, a line written in black ink. Where oblivion is planted, justice is sometimes born. Claire closed the notebook with trembling hands. Luc had been everyone's invisible witness, and perhaps the first to see how the truth can't just be punished. It can also flourish. That night, Claire placed the notebook in the new corner of the library, next to the botany and philosophy textbooks. Beneath it, a discreet sign, given by the one who cared for this garden with the patience of one awaiting redemption. Across the Channel in London, Poirot was immersed in a minor case, a stolen collection of pocket watches in Notting Hill, when he received a package in the mail. He opened it carefully. Inside, he found a black and white photograph. The villa, Lefebvre, seen from the garden. In front of it, Claire and Francis, standing, not touching, but looking at the same point on the horizon. There was no message, just on the back of the photograph, a word written in neat handwriting, "Présent." Poirot smiled, not with self-satisfaction, but with a melancholy tenderness. "Ah, voilà," she whispered. "Not the past, not the future, the present. How difficult it is to reach it, and how easy it is to lose it." He put the photo in the same drawer where the case letters were kept. Then he stood up, adjusted his vest, and walked to the window. The city kept beating. Life kept beating, but on a small strip of the Breton coast, a story of salt, blood, Ib's memory and redemption had finally found its balance. And that, thought Poirot, was the closest thing to lasting justice the world had to offer. Chapter 14. The Shadow of the Broken Picture. Winter advanced steadily, covering the coast of Camaret-sur-Mer with a white patina of frost and silent dawns. The seagulls disappeared for weeks, and the sea, far from being a melody, became a deep murmur, as if its waves contained everything the land had silenced. Inside the Lefebvre villa, stillness reigned like a fragile truce. Claire continued her process of transformation. The antique furniture was restored, the tapestries were cleaned, and some paintings were replaced with new canvases of her own. They weren't portraits, but abstractions of the sea, of salt, of the passage of time. One morning, while tidying up the attic, the same one that had hidden portraits and secrets years before, he found a dusty frame leaning against an old chest of drawers. The canvas was torn, but the bottom edge still bore part of the signature. H. Francis Hercule. Claire felt a lurch in her chest. The portrait was incomplete, barely a suggestion. A young man with a melancholic look and harsh, unfinished lines. The eyes, however, were precisely defined. They weren't Frederick's. They weren't Claire's or Jean-Baptiste's. They were Francis's. Then she remembered something she'd forgotten. When she was a child, her mother spent hours in the attic. She said she painted to forget herself. But Claire never saw what came out of those canvases. Now she understood. Solange had begun painting Francis in secret, perhaps from an old photograph, or from Frederick's memory, or simply as an attempt to imagine the grandson she'd never agreed to meet. Claire carefully lowered the painting. She placed it on the easel in her studio, where she remained for several days, observing it without daring to intervene. Shortly after New Year's, Francis returned. He didn't call. He didn't write. He simply showed up one afternoon wearing the same grey jacket as always, and a calmer expression. Claire greeted him with a brief, almost mechanical but meaningful hug. "There's something I want to show you," she said, leading him into the study. When Francis saw the torn painting, he paled. This? Solange painted it, but she never finished it. Maybe she didn't know how. He approached slowly. He traced the outline of the face with his fingers without touching the fabric. "I don't look that much like him," he said without emotion. "It's not just a portrait of you. It's what she thought she saw in you, what she feared, and what she perhaps regretted." Francis nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the eyes of the portrait. "Can I finish it?" Claire was surprised. "Do you paint?" "No, but I think for once I'd like to try to correct something. With my hands, not with words." She left him alone. Hours later, when she returned, Francis hadn't painted, but he had done something more intimate. In the lower right corner, next to Solange's initials, he had written his own in pencil. F.H. No embellishment, no artistic stroke, just a gesture. "That's all?" Claire asked. "That's enough," he replied. In London, Poirot received a second letter that month. It came not from Claire or Francis, but from a Brest notary, Maître Giraud. The content was simple. The final papers of the Lefebvre succession had been settled. Claire had ceded a significant portion of the property to Francis, who didn't claim the family name, but did claim his place as the legal heir. Poirot placed the letter in his drawer next to the previous photograph and the drawing of the sea that Claire had given him as a thank you. Then he closed the drawer and stared out the window. Raindrops tapped steadily against the glass. Justice had indeed been served, not through a trial, nor through exemplary punishment, but through a series of small gestures. A signature on a canvas, a buried jar, a wordless visit. And thinking about this, Poirot muttered one of his favourite maxims. Sometimes the toughest cases aren't solved, they're redeemed. He closed his eyes and smiled, and in the village where salt once hid secrets, now rested the incomplete portrait of a man who, at last, had a face and a place in the world. Chapter 15. Under the greenhouse floor, the first days of February arrived with an unexpected burst of sunshine that broke the grey monotony of winter. The light timidly entered through the windows of the Lefebvre villa, as if still asking permission. Claire noticed with some surprise how a few shoots were peeking out of the damp soil of the garden. It was a slow, almost symbolic rebirth, as if the house itself was slowly beginning to release, little by little, what it had been holding back for so long. Francis had stayed longer than expected. He helped with minor repairs, walked alone on the beach, and spent long periods in the shed that had once been Luke's exclusive domain. He didn't talk much, but he didn't seem to run away either. Claire let him do his thing. He no longer tried to fill the silence. He'd learned that sometimes it's better to share it than break it. One afternoon, while rearranging the greenhouse, a glass-enclosed structure adjacent to the kitchen, previously covered in dust and cobwebs, Claire discovered an irregularity in the floor, a tile that sounded hollow when stepped on. Intrigued, she brought a crowbar and carefully lifted the slab. Beneath it, he found an iron box, rusted around the edges locked with an old padlock. The padlock, however, was not secure. It was barely fitted, as if the gesture were more symbolic than real. The box contained documents. Many of them were damp and half decomposed, but others, surprisingly, remained legible. It was a collection of letters and papers that undoubtedly belonged to Solange Lefebvre. Claire called Francis without thinking. He arrived without delay, and upon seeing the contents he frowned. "What is this? It looks like a file Mom hid." But she didn't bury it or burn it. She put it right where someone curious or careful might find it. Among the documents were letters dated back to the 1930s when Solange was still young. One of them immediately caught their attention. To whoever finds it, if you're reading this, it's because the story hasn't been completely buried. There are things that aren't confessed out loud, but are preserved in silence. Frederick was my own flesh and blood. I never denied him to myself, only to others. I didn't reject him out of cruelty, but out of fear of destroying what little remained. I kept these letters so that, one day, someone might understand why the silence was so heavy. I don't forgive myself, but I leave this testimony because maybe someone else can. The signature, Claire Solange Lefebvre. Francis took a deep breath. Then, with almost trembling fingers, he picked up another letter, this time addressed directly to him, dated just a year before his death. "Francis, I don't know if these words will reach you, but if they do, I want you to know something. I saw you once, from afar. I knew who you were without any introduction. You were so like him, but also so different, stronger. I didn't know how to approach him. And when I finally tried, it was too late. I hope one day you can live without my shadow. S." Claire looked at him silently. She didn't say anything. There was no need to. Francis carefully put the letters away, but left the box on the table. "This mustn't be hidden again," he said firmly, "nor must it be displayed, but it must exist." That same night, they set up a small, locked shelf in the library, where they placed the box along with a discreet label, "Family Archives, Restricted Access." It wasn't a museum, nor a secret. It was memory. In London, Poirot received another telegram from Claire. This time, just 4 words. "That a house is breathing." Poirot read it, folded it neatly, and placed it next to the photograph of the villa. Then he walked over to his lit fireplace, folded his hands over his stomach, and closed his eyes. The case had ended, yes, but like all great cases, not with a scandal, but with a restoration. Not of things as they were, but of what, deep down, should have been. On the Breton coast, beneath the roots of a white village and the scent of salt crystals, something resembling peace had grown again. And as the fire crackled in his living room, Hercule Poirot thought, not without tenderness, that sometimes the most valuable thing is not solving a crime, but helping to reconstruct a story that could finally rest. Chapter 16. The Witness Who Never Spoke. March arrived with a sudden warmth, the prelude to a spring that seemed to promise not only the rebirth of the countryside, but also of everything that had been long buried in the Lefebvre villa. The windows remained open most of the day, and the salty, humid Atlantic air floated with a new gentleness into every room. Francis had begun restoring the greenhouse. It was no longer just a useful structure for plants. It had become his personal refuge. There he worked with his hands, sewing, tidying, pruning, while listening to the distant music Claire played in her study. It was on one of those afternoons, while removing a flower pot with dead roots, that he found what no one expected: a small brooch buried in the earth. It was made of blackened silver, engraved with an initial AS, set with a blue stone. Instantly recognizable. It was Solange Lefebvre. She held it in her hand for a long moment, not because of the object's value, but because of what it implied. Solange had been in that same place, alone at some point not so long ago. Had she accidentally dropped the brooch, or had she buried it herself? That night, Frances showed the brooch to Claire. She took it gently, recognizing it instantly. It was her favourite, she said in a faint voice. She never went out without it. I thought they buried it with her. Claire went to the family archive in the library and removed one of the newly restored documents. It was an unfinished letter, its ink smeared from humidity. One sentence stood out, in the shaky handwriting of her final days. The greenhouse is the only place where I feel like he watches me without resentment. They both looked at each other in silence. Do you think I came here to talk to him? Frances asked. Claire nodded, her eyes moist. Perhaps he spoke to his memory, to Frederick, or to you, or with the words he never knew how to say out loud. The night was silent, but something in the echo of that discovery had resonated loudly, as if there was still a silent witness waiting to be heard. The next day, Claire decided to go through her mother's old drawings. She knew Solange had left sketches, unfinished portraits, and artist's notes in a piece of furniture she had avoided opening for years. A bow-topped chest of drawers that still smelled of dried lavender. There she found a thin notebook with bent corners. He opened it. There were a series of charcoal-drawn faces, some clearly recognizable as Jean-Baptiste, others as unidentified children. But on one of the last pages, she found a face unfamiliar to her. It wasn't Francis, not Armand, not Luc. It was a young man with curly hair and an intense, melancholy expression. In the bottom corner, his mother had written in pencil, "He knew." Claire felt a chill. Who was that young man? He lowered the notebook to Francis. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he frowned. "I'm not sure, but I think I saw him once, in one of the old photos in the archive. Come with me." They went together to the office, where the family album Poirot had examined during the investigation still lay. They turned page after page until they found it. A photo from 1934, in the villa's garden. Solange in the centre, Frederick on the right, and a tall young man on the left. No name, no mention. It's him, Francis confirmed. The one in the drawing. Claire bowed. Why would Mom write, "He knew"? What did she know? Francis was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke slowly. Perhaps not all the secrets surrounding Frederick were yours. Perhaps someone else knew what had been done to him, what had been kept quiet, what had been changed in the records. This person could have witnessed the rejection or been complicit in its silencing. Claire looked over the date, 1934, the year Frederick officially disappeared. A few hours later, Claire contacted Maître Giraud, the notary. "I need a name," he said. "Was there anyone else working at the Lefebvre house in the 1930s besides Hélène Dubois?" The notary responded without hesitation. There was an accounting apprentice, a 17-year-old boy. His name was Jules Lemercier. He was only there for a year. Then he left without a trace. Why? Because I think he witnessed an act he should never have witnessed, Claire replied. Later that evening, Claire sat down to write. This time not to Poirot, nor to Francis. She wrote a letter that began like this. "Mr. Lemercier, if this letter finds you, it is because something you kept silent still breathes." The story they had thought was closed, apparently, had one last breath. And on the other side of the world, without yet knowing it, Hercule Poirot felt a slight tingling on the back of his neck. A feeling, one that, like salt, drifted in from the shore. Because even the oldest secrets sometimes leave undissolved crystals. Chapter 17. The name among the books, the letter sent to Jules Lemercier, left for Nantes on a Friday morning, with the same kind of uncertainty that had accompanied all the important letters in the Lefebvre family's history. The uncertainty of whether they would be read or simply filed away in the shadows. Claire held no immediate hope, but she also couldn't ignore what her instinct was telling her, that the young man drawn in her mother's notebook and captured in an old family photograph still had a role in history. Francis, for his part, turned back to the greenhouse. But this time he placed a notebook on the work table. It wasn't a diary or a sketchbook, but a sort of chronological record of everything he had discovered since his arrival, a way to organize what he still couldn't fully digest. One afternoon, while Claire was sorting through the old ledgers stored in the office loft, among columns of dust and margins annotated in strict handwriting, she found something she hadn't expected, a black-covered volume, thicker than the others. It had no title. When she opened it, she knew immediately it wasn't an account book. It was a record, a log written by Solange Lefebvre. Dated at irregular intervals between 1931 and 1940. In it, she recounted, with a mixture of formality and restrained emotion, the daily events of the villa. She had no intention of confessing, but neither did she intend to lie. The entry that caught his attention the most was dated August 1934. Jules walked into the office today, unaware I was there. He was holding a piece of paper torn from an old will. He asked me if it was valid. I told him not to worry, that family matters weren't his area of expertise. But something in his expression unsettled me, not out of malice, but out of a precocious understanding. He's a brilliant young man, and dangerous. Claire felt her blood rush to the surface. This confirmed not only that Jules had learned the truth about Frederick, but that he had also touched, seen, and perhaps kept fragments of the original will. A document that, if revealed now, could completely reshape the family's public image. She showed the log to Francis. He read it silently. Then he looked up. So, Jules was silenced, or scared, Claire replied. Mom wasn't a violent woman, but she did know how to use the power of fear. Maybe she simply made him understand that talking wasn't good for him. And then, over time, he decided to forget. And if he didn't do it? So now you're the only living witness to the first lie, the one that started it all. 3 days later, The reply arrived, a yellowed envelope with torn edges and shimmering ink. Signed in pen, Jules Le Mercier. Inside, a short letter, written with an old man's hand. Miss Lefebvre, I never imagined this story would come back to me at this point. For a year, the villa was a palace and a well for me. I saw things I couldn't fully understand, but I do remember that August day. The sheet of paper I found wasn't just a fragment. It was an entire clause, crossed out, with Frederick Héroux's name clearly visible. I didn't save the document, but I copied it. Out of fear, or out of respect for the truth, I still have it. If you'd like, I can send you a transcript, but know that I'm not looking for scandal, just peace. The letter ended with an address and a telephone number. Claire closed the letter with trembling hands. He copied the document. He has it. So what are you going to do? Francis asked, crossing his arms. Claire hesitated. I'm going to call him, not because of the inheritance, not to restore the family name, but because the story deserves closure. And Mum, even though it was late, was looking for him. That same night, Claire dialed the number. The voice that answered was that of a tired but lucid man. They spoke for almost an hour. Jules remembered the room, the hallways, the atmosphere with precision, and he also remembered that Solange, the last time she saw him, had said goodbye with a peculiar phrase, "Remember that not all names are made to be remembered. Some live only on the margins." That phrase had haunted him for years. He had kept the copy of the crossed-out clause, not out of rebellion, but out of deferred justice. The next day, Jules sent the transcript, and with it an additional note. This document was never destroyed, only rewritten. But in it, Frederick was called by his full name, and he was assigned not only inheritance, but moral legitimacy. That's what scared Solange. And Armand. Because they didn't want a child. They wanted a mistake gone. Claire read those lines and understood finally that the whole mystery, all the deaths, all the silences, hadn't been caused by just an inheritance or a surname. They had been caused by fear of a piece of paper, of a written word, still full, name. In London, Poirot received the news by letter. This time, the letter contained only one line. History has stopped whispering, it speaks now. And Hercule Poirot, without saying a word, placed that last letter in his file. Then he got up, closed the window, and lit a lamp, because he knew, with the precision of his famous grey cells, that even crimes already solved have echoes. Echoes that, over time, are transformed into justice. Chapter 18. The Legacy of Soult. Spring finally arrived in Camaret-sur-Mer, not with a bang or celebration, but with a slow, almost ceremonial rhythm. Greenery crept back up the garden walls. Wild flowers reappeared between the stones of the path, and the sea breeze began to blow with a warmth not felt for years. The Lefebvre villa, still silent, was beginning to look different, not because of its walls or its ceilings, but because of the life that, little by little, was returning to it. The greenhouse was in full bloom, and the library, once a sanctuary of oblivion, was now a reading space open to the public. Claire, rather than concealing the names of her lineage, had hung a discreet plaque above the entrance. Héroux Lefebvre House, 1884, present. A simple act, but loaded with justice. That afternoon, Francis was sorting through the family archive when he found, between two duplicate record books, one last letter. It was recent, dated just a few weeks before Solange's death, and with a Paris address on the return address. He opened it. He immediately recognized the handwriting. It was by Armand Delatour. As long as don't blame me for what you're about to do. We both know that Frederick was already a crack in this edifice when Lucien was still breathing. It was you who chose to bury him alive. And it was you who, by approaching his son, exposed everything again. But don't fear what we'll leave behind. The Lefebvre name will prevail. I'll take care of it with affection. A. Claire read the letter with Francis. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The document, based on its content and tone, didn't reveal direct complicity in the crime, but it did reveal what Poirot had already sensed, that Armand Delatour hadn't murdered out of opportunity, but out of ideology. For him, family wasn't a tree, but a wall, and Frederick, an assault on his purity. Claire placed the letter in the file, but not before writing a note in the margin. Blood doesn't wash away. It just changes form. Days later, Francis proposed an idea that surprised Claire. I want to place a memorial, stone in the garden, not a grave, a reminder of Frederick and of my mother. And the last name, none, just the names, Frederick and Hélène. They were born without inheritance, they lived without recognition. At least let them have a place to be remembered without judgment. Claire agreed without hesitation. They chose the quietest corner of the garden, under the old cherry tree, where the sun only reached in the mornings and where the air smelled of damp earth. The stone was simple, a block of light granite, unadorned, just an inscription. Here, where once there was silence, now there is memory. F and H. There was no ceremony, just the two of them. Claire placed a bouquet of lavender. Francis buried a small jar of salt next to the base, as an offering. In London, Hercule Poirot received an unexpected invitation. A handwritten card with the town's letterhead. Mr. Poirot, we've finished restoring the house. We'd like to invite you to see how it's changed, not as a detective, but as a witness. Claire and Francis Poirot, for the first time in months, took the train to France without carrying a notebook. Upon arriving at the villa, he was greeted with genuine smiles and perfectly served tea. He walked slowly through the rooms. He noted the restored walls, the arranged books, the unfinished portrait of Frederick, now hanging proudly above the fireplace. You've transformed it, he said with a gentle smile. Not just the house, the story too. Claire nodded. The ghosts are still here. But they don't scream anymore. They talk, and we hear them. Before leaving, Poirot asked to visit the garden. He stopped before the memorial stone, bowed slightly, and placed a button from his lapel on the ground. For those who didn't have a voice, he said softly, and for those who learned to listen to it. That night, as the train took him back to London, Poirot closed his eyes and recapitulated the case. Not for pleasure, but out of habit. He remembered every clue, every contradiction, every face. And then he thought, crime was a matter of silence, justice of words, and redemption of actions. As the train passed over the Loire Bridge, Poirot opened his notebook for the last time and wrote a single line in his meticulous handwriting. The secret hidden in the salt was a name, and with that the case was closed forever.